Hey guys, Derek here, and today I'm going to do a video that I've been wanting to do for quite some time, and that's one on nitro helicopter engines. Over the last year or so, I've seen a huge influx of new nitro helicopter pilots into the hobby, both at my local field and at most of the fun flies that I've attended this year. And it's been great to see a lot more pilots get into nitro. But as a result of that, I've gotten a lot more questions about nitro engine tuning, various maybe small issues pilots have seen with their engines. And I just want to take some time to kind of go over some of the more common questions and issues that I've come across during my travels this past flying season. And hopefully, whether you're a new nitro pilot or someone who's been flying them for a few years, you'll find the tips and tricks in this video helpful. Okay guys, so one of the first things I want to cover here is an issue I've seen some pilots have with the regulated OS engines. So if you have the OS 105 HZR or one of the 91 HZRs or even the 55 HZR, this will be of interest to you. I've seen some pilots complain where they've had fuel dripping out of their carburetor. And usually associated with this is they've had some tuning issues where their engine is always running rich. Basically what's happened here, if you have fuel dripping out of your carburetor on one of the regulated engines, is your regulator stopper valve has either gotten gummed up and stuck open, or there's some debris trapped between the stopper valve and the inlet hole that it seals against. So I actually have one of my spare regulators that I've pulled apart here just so I can show you exactly where the issue lies. Your fuel comes in through this barb fitting right here and feeds in through the hole above the tip of my 0.9mm wrench. And that hole right there is where the stopper valve seals against. So if we take a look at the stopper valve, I have it right here. It's this very tiny machine piece with this rubber conical seal on the end. And if you look closely, you can actually see where the conical seal makes contact with that hole. You can see that little line that's worn around there. So when this piece, basically, when you get debris trapped between this conical seal and that hole that we were just looking at, or this piece here gets gummed up in the regulator, that's when you have fuel flow problems, as this is what truly actually meters the fuel going into your engine. So as far as solving that issue, there's a few different things I've tried. In some cases, if you pull the regulator apart, which technically will void your warranty with OS, you can clean it out with some isopropyl alcohol. You do not have to take it all apart like I just did to show you guys. In fact, I would just leave it together, just take the diaphragm out, and just spray some isopropyl alcohol in there and really flush it around and just wipe it out and dry it all out. And usually if it's just gummed up, that will solve the problem. Make sure that when you reassemble it that you orient your diaphragm correctly. I have the diaphragm right here, and you can see one side has this hole cut into it and the other side is flat. And you basically want the side with the hole cut into it to face this way. So if we look at this one as a reference, the hole should face towards the back, towards those little holes cut out in the cover plate. So make sure you have this oriented correctly when you put it back together. It's very important. If you do not want to take the regulator apart and possibly void your warranty, you can also return it to Hobby Services and explain the problem to you. They'll either clean the regulator out for you or they may replace it entirely, depending on how long the problem's persisted for you. So if you're really struggling with it, the best course of action is to take advantage of your OS warranty and return the regulator to them and let them take care of it for you. But most pilots I've seen with this engine are very happy with it. I've had great success. This engine in my Heli right here is actually 2 years old, and my regulator's been working great. So hopefully that helps some of you that may be having an issue with this sticking. Okay guys, so this next step I want to go over is talking about why it's important to keep your nitro helicopter clean. And I get a lot of ribbing from some of the guys around my local field about how clean I keep my engine and whatnot, but I actually have a good reason for doing so. If you ever get any sort of air or fuel leak on your nitro engine system, it almost always results in your engine running a little bit leaner due to the extra air being introduced into the engine from the leak. So by keeping the engine pretty clean and oil-free, if you have any sort of leak, it usually is pretty obvious, as you'll start to see some black residue from maybe two parts that loosened up and are starting to rub against each other, and kind of you get that black gritty kind of paste. Or you'll see oil everywhere if you have just fuel kind of leaking out from somewhere. So by keeping your engine clean and paying attention to where oil is coming from, you can actually detect leaks and address them quickly before you might damage your engine. Another important thing I want to mention is particularly around fuel tanks. You want to make sure that your fuel tank is sealed up. So this kind of ties into my tip around the engine with keeping it pretty clean. If you notice that your fuel tank is all oily or something, then you might want to check and look and see if there's a crack in the plastic somewhere, or if you have a tiny pinhole leak. I've seen on some helicopters that have the barb kind of molded into the tank like the T-Rex, or sometimes where they plastic weld the two halves together, there can sometimes be just a tiny little pinhole leak there. And on a pressurized system like the OS regulated system that I have here, you might notice some small air bubbles coming out of there after your flight. So if you have that type of leak, you can usually address it by cleaning up the barb really well with some isopropyl alcohol and getting it nice and dry. And then just using maybe a toothpick or something, you could apply a little bit of CA around to where it's leaking, just a little bit. You don't want to coat it or anything, and that should plug up the leak. So the next thing I want to talk about are these rubber grommets that are used on virtually every Nitro helicopter's fuel tank. It's important to make sure that these are in good shape and are sealed. You can see mine here. I can rub all around my tank and it's perfectly dry. There's no oil or any fuel leaking out of here. And there's a few ways you can keep these grommets in really great shape. If you notice, my fuel tank is filled with fuel. And part of the reason I do that is to keep my fuel magnet nice and wet and maintain that as long as possible. But another reason is also to keep these seals wet. So when they're wet, they actually swell up a little bit from the nitro fuel, and this helps your fuel tank seal better. So for those of you who store your tanks completely empty, when you take all the fuel out of here, the fuel vent that was in the seal from when you were flying eventually evaporates out, and it causes the grommet to kind of shrivel up a little bit and harden up. And this is a lot of the time when I see air leaks start to happen, and people will have fuel all over around this area. Or if you're running some of the older line helicopters, you might see some down around there, around that plug that we use in these tanks. So something to keep in mind there is to just leave fuel in your tank all the time. I have fuel in my helicopter's tank all year long. Sometimes I've left it in there for even a few months. Another important area is this check valve. This basically traps the positive pressure from the downstroke of your piston into the fuel line, upstream or downstream, I guess, of the check valve and your fuel tank. So it keeps this line and your fuel tank pressurized with positive pressure only. In order to make your engine run correctly. You do not want to run the engine without this, and you want to make sure that it is installed in the correct orientation with that little notch there pointing towards the fuel line that runs into the engine. So I've seen sometimes, especially if this check valve sits around for a while, where fuel winds up running down your fuel tubing, it gets trapped inside the check valve, and then it tends to dry out and kind of gum it up. And this causes the check valve to maybe get stuck closed, and your engine can run lean as a result of that. So if your engine's been in storage for a while, or maybe it's been maybe this check valve, you leave it unplugged all the time or something, where the fuel that might be inside of it is exposed to ambient air, can evaporate and basically leave this sticky, gummy, oily residue in there. So you might want to just pull it apart. Be careful, because there's a couple little tiny pieces in here, and just spray it out with some rubbing alcohol just to clear any of the oil out, and just clean it up really good, and then put it back together and back on your machine. So I mean, if you haven't flown for a while and you go out and fly and you notice your engine's running really lean, this probably would be one of the first areas I would check. So just a little tip around the check valve. So one other thing I want to talk about is the O-ring on the carburetor retainer. So that's the carb retainer right in there, and there is a O-ring on either side of it that is used to seal off your carburetor from the outside. So if you notice that you have oil developing around there, or especially in that little corner there right next to the retainer, then your O-ring inside the carb retainer may have degraded, or it may have gotten cut when you took the engine apart, or any of that sort of thing. So make sure you pay attention to that area and keep those O-rings replaced. OS sells them in a package separately. I bought a big bag of these from McMaster-Carr. You can get a 100 pack for a few bucks off McMaster-Carr. I'll put a link in my video here for you. But I would just pay attention to those O-rings and keep them regularly replaced, as those are the ones I see leak most frequently. In this next segment, I'd like to show you guys how I apply RTV to my muffler. Over the years, I've heard many different theories and opinions on how to seal your muffler against your engine, whether it be an epoxy, or a metal gasket, or some of the rubber gaskets some of the mufflers include. But I've always found that Permatex RTV worked the best when applied correctly. So I've gone ahead here and cleaned off the old layer of RTV for my muffler. There's a little bit left here, but it's mostly cleaned up well enough for us to apply our next layer here. So you want to get this cleaned up if it's a used pipe and you had some previous adhesive on it. You want to just scrape that off as best you can. And roughing up the surface here will actually help the RTV adhere to the exhaust manifold here a little bit better as well. Once we've got it cleaned up, it's a good idea too to wipe it off with some isopropyl alcohol. Same thing on the engine half over here. And once you've got that done, we're ready to actually apply the copper RTV. To do so, we're going to go ahead and open this up. And I'm looking to get about this much to start with. The important part here is to just get an even, thin layer applied. You can kind of dab it around with your finger. Having some paper towels available during this will help as well, as this can get a little bit messy. But you want to just go ahead and apply a nice thin layer all the way around. I'm not too worried about where it's going at this point, as I'm going to clean it up before we move onward. But to start, you want to go ahead and get just a nice thin layer like that around. The next thing you want to do is take a little bit more, and you want to apply a little bit extra here towards the bottom, a little bit heavier of a layer, and a little bit heavier of a layer towards the top as well. And the reason I do that is I found that typically when I have a leak in my exhaust system, it's usually coming from either the bottom or the top. I always found that putting just a little bit thicker layer right below the mounting bolt on the lower portion and upper portion of the muffler exhaust flange here tends to help with that. So once you've got that, I'm just going to kind of go around here and just even this out a little bit more. You want to just get the coating relatively equal all the way around the exhaust flange here, so something like that. Once you've got that done, now what we want to do is clean out the area inside of the exhaust flange here. So I like to use Q-tips for this. So you can take a Q-tip and just carefully wipe around the inside. Okay guys, so I've just gone off camera and cleaned this up just a little bit more, but this is basically ready to go on to the helicopter. As you can see here, there is no RTV inside of the exhaust manifold. And if you look close around the rim, you can see I've kind of wiped the RTV away a little bit all the way around here. The reason for that is when you bolt this up onto the engine, you want to make sure that none of the RTV oozes into the exhaust path. So you just want to wipe it a little bit further away from the flange as I've done so here. And that will help prevent the RTV from getting in that exhaust path and then later breaking off and ruining your glow plugs. So another area I want to talk about is this plug that's found on just about every exhaust out here, whether it's a Hattori or another brand. It's very important to make sure that you have a good seal here, whether you're using a bolt to plug it off or the regulated system that OS uses, or if you're running muffler pressure and using a nipple such as this one that I have here that threads into that port. In either case, you want to make sure you have a great seal right here. A lot of times I see pilots who have brown stains or maybe even black stains from their exhaust leaking right here all over their muffler. And not only does it make your muffler look ugly, but it's actually allowing additional air to enter into your engine and once again disturb our fuel to air mixture. So it's very important that you have this sealed off correctly, and it will help your muffler stay pretty longer. So while I do this, I once again use some Permatex RTV. It works very well to hold this bolt in. I don't think I've had a bolt come loose since I started using RTV in the last 4 or 5 years. Once again, when applied correctly. So what you want to do is you want to clean out the threads of the muffler really good with isopropyl alcohol. And similarly, you want to clean up your bolt threads. I happen to have a spare bolt here. Really thoroughly with isopropyl alcohol so they're nice and dry. And then I would apply some RTV up here on these first 2 or 3 threads. You don't want it hanging off the end here, or it could get sucked into your engine. You want to apply just a little bit up here on the top, and then you can go ahead and thread it into your engine. So for those of you running a Tory muffler, I just want to point out a few things surrounding these grommets and O-rings here. So Hattori 90 class and larger mufflers use these silicone grommets and an O-ring to provide kind of a floating muffler mount, if you will, so that you can dampen some of the vibration in the helicopter. Over time, though, the silicone used to make these grommets gets hard just from the heat of the engine running and the heat from the exhaust. And as they get harder, they get more brittle and they start to lose their elasticity and they start to shrink a little bit. And as that happens, the muffler starts to get really sloppy in the mount. These are fairly new, so you can see there's just a little bit of a play here, which is perfectly normal. But if you start to notice that you have a lot of play in the muffler body, then you're going to want to go ahead and replace the grommets. And typically, whenever I've had to replace the grommets, 99 times out of 100, the O-rings will be due to be replaced as well, as those are similarly subjected to some pretty high temperatures, which over time cause the O-ring to break down and crack. So I would replace those as a set. So another thing I'd like to talk about just very quickly here are exhaust deflectors. I've gotten quite a few questions about these actually. Running these or not running these doesn't impact your tune whatsoever. There's such an insignificant length of pipe in the whole exhaust system that I haven't noticed any difference whether I run them or not as far as tuning goes, so I wouldn't sweat that, guys. They do, however, help a little bit with keeping the oil off your helicopter. I have noticed my machine stays just a little bit cleaner when I run one than when I don't, so I've started running them again. And the last thing I guess I've gotten asked is, why do I cut my deflectors short, as a lot of them are considerably longer than this. The only reason I do that is in flight this thing is flapping around all over the place, and the longer it is, the more area that the air and everything as you're flying around has to act on, so the more it deflects. And what happens is, over time, all this flexing eventually causes the rubber here to just crack and break off, and this will come flying off in flight. Okay guys, so the next thing I want to talk about here are glow plugs. And glow plugs are actually a useful tool to give us an idea of how our engine is running. If you pull them out and take a look at the coloring and the condition of the element in here. This one I just took out of my T-Rex 700 Nitro. It's a fairly new plug, so there's really no discoloration on it, and the element still looks pretty much perfect. What you want to look for is a nice brown color around the top of the glow plug. This is a good indication that your engine is running in tune. What you don't want to see is black. If you do see lots of black build up along the top surface here, then that means you're burning oil, which means you are running way too hot and therefore running lean. You also want to pay attention to the condition of the element in here. If you notice that coil of platinum that forms this element is all distorted or bent or chalky kind of white, then you either have an issue with your shimming and you need to add some shims as you have some detonation going on, or you are just plain running too lean. On the other end of the spectrum, if you notice your glow plug is very oily and wet with fuel and there's really no discoloration and the element still looks pretty good, then that's an indication that you're running rich. In that case, you might want to lean your needles a little bit more. You've got some room there if that's what your glow plug looks like after you put some fuel through it. One more thing I want to show you guys before we move on is a trick to putting your glow plug back in. I can't tell you how many people I see fight with this at the field, but this is actually something the airplane pilots at one of my local flying fields taught me a few years ago. If you take your glow plug, like I have right here, and we put on our copper washer, and if you notice, I've got some medium fuel tubing that I've just simply slid over the end of the element. And what this does is it actually fits perfectly over the end of the glow plug and gives you just enough grip so that when you go in here and turn it, it'll spin the glow plug. And the tubing gives some flexibility here so that the glow plug can kind of find the threads and you can get the thread started nicely like I've done here. So that's a nice trick to get it started without stripping out the cylinder head, and then you've got to go and order a new cylinder head, which really sucks because they're not cheap. Once you've got it started in there, you can go ahead and take your wrench. I've got an 8mm socket screwdriver here, and you just tighten your glow plug.